Five Nights at Freddy's. Need I say more? There's no way you don't know what this is. I mean, you can't escape it. Between the fast billion-dollar movie, the unescapable Funko merch, and the plentiful of memes, it's reached the far corners of the internet, for better or for worse. And here you are, having clicked a video about the lore, so I at least hope you have an inkling of an idea of what's going on here. So let's just toss the general explanation out the window and let's talk about VR. More specifically, Help Wanted, or FNAF VR Help Wanted, was released to the public May 28th of 2019, and everybody collectively shat their pants both in excitement and in fear. The game was an arousing success. Is that really the word? Oh well. Not only from a gameplay standpoint, where the game was a mix of both new minigames that worked perfectly with the VR environment, but also perfectly remade versions of the previous FNAF games. Though I still don't know what they were doing with the Funtime Freddy nights. Oh shit! And of course, we gotta talk about that sweet, sweet lore that introduced very interesting plot points. But what was introduced? Well, for starters, Fazbear Inc. is now an LCC, a limited liability corporation. I'm not American. I don't know what that means. So, Fazbear's now trying to rebuild their piece of shit brand, which is actually pretty front and center for the lore for once. Following that, Willy the British fucker can't stay dead. But that's like the entire plot point. Nothing is new under the sun, though I wish there was something new under the roof of Freddy Fazbear's. And finally, secret tapes made by a beta tester who was a part of the second dev team responsible for the VR game. In universe now, I'm not talking about real life. There was only one. Now, what is the video about? Well, hopefully the title did a good enough job explaining it, but it would be lazy having an explanation about something inside of another medium. In Freddy Fuck-Ass's golden experience, there's a series of 16 tapes. Contained within these tapes is often not the usual office goss like Jeremy cutting his own face off, you know, the usual. The tapes have been discussed to death by Mateus, pregnant with Springtrap's child, the game theorist, and other pheromones all over the internet, but one tape has a single very key paragraph that has been largely undiscussed and I feel even ignored over these past few years. Lucky tape number 13. There's a very specific part which is rather important, so let's just take a listen to the tape, shall we?
They lied to us. They lied to all of us. They told us that the whole point of this VR game was to undo the bad PR done by a rogue indie game developer who supposedly made up a bunch of crazy stories that tarnished the brand. But that's not true at all. In their haste to develop this VR game and clear their name, they sent us some things I don't think they intended us to see, such as a hard drive containing emails between Fazbear Entertainment and a certain indie developer. Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer. Those indie games were designed to conceal and make light of what happened. This isn't just an attempt to rebrand. It's an elaborate cover-up, a campaign to discredit everything.
Not only is saying concealed and make light of in the same sentence an oxymoron, but this also makes me want to shit an anvil. Like a famous philosopher once said, when will you learn that your actions have consequences? So, I welcome you all to How to Write a Good Trustworthy Narrative 101. Congratulations, Help Wanted, you have failed the class because you somehow managed to make the worst case of an unreliable narrator I have ever seen. Now, what is an unreliable narrator? Perhaps it's an overarching storyteller that can't be trusted because they are giving contradictory information as the story goes along, obviously being untrustworthy when recalling accounts, or perhaps even making the whole story up. Well, yes. Some examples of this is Kaiser Sose from The Usual Suspects, or Patrick Masturbate Man from American Psycho. Other more relevant examples to the medium we work in is spoilers for Danganronpa V3, just really quick in case you have not played it. Both Kaede and Tsumugi are intentionally unreliable narrators, being a major part of the game's theme. Otherwise, we have people such as GLaDOS, the Stanley Parable, and Amnesia, just to name a few. But it's worth mentioning that unreliable narrators are, in a way, much more difficult to incorporate and utilize in an interactive medium such as gaming. It's not like Crash Bandicoot 3 is known for its deep, complex narrative, and in the case of many narrative games, such as visual novels and adventure games, there often isn't a narrator in that sense that can mislead you, as often you're in control and you can see the events playing out before you. But that's not to say that unreliable narrators are impossible to make in gaming or unheard of. I mean, no duh, I just named a bunch of them. To get a bit more in depth, an unreliable narrator, as the name suggests, and as I mentioned earlier, is someone who leads the narrative in a way that makes them unreliable for the reader to trust. This can be done through several ways. Some unreliable narrators are doing so to conceal the truth they know, actively lying and diverging the reader/viewer to make them believe their own version of the story. Other unreliable narrators are not intentionally doing so. Instead, they might be someone who lies unintentionally, so a pathological liar. Most commonly is the fact that almost every first-person narration has a certain amount of unreliability to it, as a singular person cannot, if they're not omnipotent of course, know everything that's happening around them, not even about the people closest to them. And in more intentional cases where the narrator is to be unreliable because they are the human the story is told through, characters and people can be painted in different lights because of the narrator's own personal vendetta or view of said people. In most cases, the unreliable narrator is not presented as such at the start of the medium, instead being used to trick the reader or viewer of the media into believing the narrator's authority and later using it to create a twist. This gives the narration a new light upon revisiting the media later on, and this also gives new light to the story entirely once it's revealed, often tying up loose ends or explaining inconsistencies or plot holes. There are also novels and movies who put the unreliable narrator front and center to often make the story a lot more confusing or ask the viewer to draw their own conclusions. The thing is, a planned and well-conceived unreliable narrator can change a story in so many different ways. It can make an otherwise uneventful story super interesting to revisit, for it's now in a different light. It can also change your perspective or even change your final verdict of a work. But an unintentional, unreliable narrator is a very, very big problem when it comes to stories. Because while a bad, intentional, unreliable narrator can just sour an experience, an unintentional one can legit cripple the trust and plot of a story. Hence, it's very important to be aware of what connotations certain directions have when writing or working on a story. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is to make your reader question the credibility or relevancy of your entire story. Now away from the English lesson and back to point with the fuck-ass bear game. The line indicates that the indie game, or what we know as FNAF 1-2 sister location, can't be trusted. The so-called Rogue the Indie dev was after all hired by Freddy Fazant to keep spreading the so-called truth about what happened in the big Freddy's locations. They were actively trying to discredit the dev so that they can look good. They just care about their public image and sweeping it all under the rug. So in short, Freddy Fazbear created these games. They wanted to conceal the fact of what happened, whilst at the same time making light of them. Which is still a fucking oxygen moron of a sentence. Now, since this is a video about the problems of this statement and the lore added to Help Wanted, we are gonna have to take a slight detour to help us understand both what happens in the games, as in the game universe, as well as how this actually becomes a massive problem for the consistency of the lore. And we find this within the worst thing ever conceived in this godforsaken series, the books. I sat through and read 50 pages of the slop known as the story of Help Wanted from Tales of the Pizzaplex. Now, the only really important parts are in the beginning. In this garbage, we follow Stefan Sniffass, a broke bitch game developer who gets approached by some fuckwad from Fazbear Entertainment who wants him to develop 4 spooky games around the Fazbear names to make fun of the murders that happen. Unfortunately, I am not joking about that. That is pretty much how they pitched it. Understandably, Snotass says no until he's drugged and given some of that good old robot Uzi. And to quote the man who represented Fazbear, they should be scary, but at the same time, they should poke fun at the ridiculousness of all those libelous rumors and accusations. And all of this keeps pointing back to don't trust Fazbear nor the rogue indie developer. So once you learn about the Unreliable Narrator, you cannot view any of the 4 original games in the same light. Now, of course, you could say that this changes nothing. And perhaps you have a point. So, the games were made in universe. What's the big deal? And I can already hear somebody shouting from the mountains that it can't be an unreliable narrator. It's not presented as one. And you would think that. I mean, it makes sense, though that's not exactly how that works. An unreliable narrator is often created from intent. But when 2 different developers are working on the same series, then I think that this is a case where it's created through accident. On one side, you have a row of games telling the story that very much happened within universe. Bite of 83 is a real thing. The missing children's incident is a real thing. Michael's shitty-ass pizzeria burning to the ground with everybody still inside. Yeah, that happened. And then you have a game that basically tells us that everything is a lie. You can kinda see how this causes some issues. But still, there's a major flaw in your argument. We don't know if the games are one and the same. And that's a valid point. However, the intro of FNAF VR showed screenshots of all the games, or at least FNAF 1 to sister location, as the indie developers' games are being discussed, and just simple visual storytelling showing that what they're talking about is the games that we're familiar with. But it was only set out to make full game. The books are such a convoluted source to use. Scott himself said that they aren't a perfect match to the FNAF universe when Charlie's trilogy was being released. I don't care if the Steam post is deleted. I still think his words are important. Do William share a name in both the games and the books? Yes, but why do you think that is? For once, I honestly think it's for the sake of clarity. It's a moment of, hey, this guy's the purple guy. Because if Scott had named him Dave Miller or Steve Raglan, there might have been another pink guy situation on our hands. Also, if Mr. Stinky Gas is the name of the indie dev in the games as well, then he could have just made all of the games and then died like he did in the book. The books aren't a perfect mean to solving the games, they're just here to provide clues. Regardless, FNAF effectively went from a fine Swiss cheese to a stinky blue cheese. So what? FNAF's now got an unreliable narrator. It's not the end of the world though. No, it's not, but it's the end of the FNAF world, as we know it, because if we can't trust all the Scott-made games, the foundation of FNAF, the things we've used as the basis from the start has now come into questioning. So, is William Afton truly a bad person, or is he merely a fall guy that Fazbear Entertainment has set up to take the blame? After all, even without William around, tragedies still happened. Can one man truly be that evil that he keeps coming back time and time again for what? Revenge? Bloodthirst? It would explain William's lack of motive. A fall guy doesn't necessarily have a motive. Then at the time, past 5 years of FNAF comes into questioning whether they can actually be the truth or just a fabrication of Fazbear Entertainment's bullshit. And truth be told, that would explain one major part of FNAF. Goosebumps. Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex. What are they? The horror stories. No shit. But it's a series of anthology stories. Kinda like multiple different people telling stories about the same entity. If the games aren't to be trusted, I don't think that the books that some people are using to explain the stories can be trusted either, because they could be stories just made up by some people, or more horse waste by Fazbear Entertainment as a mean to cover up.
Hold it!
Alright, Silva, I think you've gone on long enough with this. You've gone on and on about how the games can't be trusted anymore, but William Afton still appears in Security Breach, flesh and all. If William Afton still exists, locked within the Springtrap suit, it must mean that William Afton got Springtrap due to the ghost that he killed. The existence of the blob should also point to the fact that some sort of entity is aware and holds a grudge against William. To add to this fact, the blob is composed of several different parts of animatronics we know are mostly haunted. So this, without a shadow of a doubt, must mean that the events of FNAF 1 to 4 must have still transpired, otherwise these elements wouldn't exist within Security Breach or Ruin. Speaking of Ruin, didn't that kinda confirm that this ending was non-canonical? Even if we don't base it off the comics that Gregory drew, the lack of the musty rabbit in the basement clearly points towards what we've known since, well, Help Wanted actually, that this William Afton is just... My biggest counter to all of this is, what can we trust anymore? FNAF 1 to sister location? Absolutely not. Help Wanted calls that into questioning. Pizza Sim? Well, the location may exist inside of the basement of the Pizza Flex, but it's not like that confirms that the events of the game happened. UCN? Can't trust Help Wanted due to the two people telling us information, but in the grand scheme of things, this doesn't really change anything, nor does it fix our lore problems. But I think it's interesting that for a franchise with an obsessive community that has poked and prodded, cried and screamed about inconsistencies, about relevancy, about canonicity, that the fact that a canon line in a mainline FNAF game that has such a massive and franchise-changing implications that it's just gone totally undiscussed is not only impressive, but also kind of weird. How many videos aren't there about modern FNAF and solving it, and just this massive glaring hole in the fabric of the franchise has gone completely unmentioned 99% of the time? And I've never seen anyone actually consider the implications of the lore in question. Did Steelwool intend to create this plot hole? 1000% sure they didn't, but the fact of the matter is that they still ripped the fabric. And we've gotten zero follow-ups or even discussions about it whatsoever. It's not like I think this will get real implications. But with how thorough the FNAF community is, I wish to add that close reading aspects and highlight what could potentially be an undiscussed plot point, or an accidental pitfall Steelwool put in there themselves. After all plot holes are almost never intentional, but accidents from digging your own literary grave. Hence, I wanted to put a spotlight on it, because depending on how the story continues, this hole could cause troubles that are not intended to be read as such.